Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Michael Castell. I'm from a interdisciplinary department called the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick. And the talk that I'm going to give is going to sort of cover I guess the details of contemporary artificial intelligence in kind of as low level way I can get within a short presentation, and use that as a sort of jumping off point to look at how the concept of sort of contemporary AI ethics has developed over the last, say, 10 or 12 years. The reason I'm doing this is just because to me, I think that being less afraid of how contemporary AI works is very sort of helpful in terms of addressing some of these what seem like sort of larger scale, or what are larger scale issues. And I'm sort of basing a lot of this material in a class that I teach at Warwick called Interdisciplinary Machine Learning, where the students don't necessarily have a strong sort of maths or computer science background. They might be from social sciences, they might be from various professions like journalism, and I really try to get them to the point where they can they can engage with cutting edge AI research in some way. They can they can read the papers without being scared of them. So that's what sort of the first part of this session is based on, and so I call this the feeling for the organism, and the idea is to try to get a sort of hands-on appreciation for what's going on with what I call 21st century artificial intelligence, or this sort of neural network manifestation of AI, and so I'm going to step through these sort of like using a kind of STS and historical perspective, step through some of the concepts and sort of the basics of this stuff for those of you who are unfamiliar. And then in the second part, I'll talk about sort of why is AI ethics a sort of a resurgent or maybe insurgent topic. How has it sort of emerged from both the sort of ideological background of AI and from the sort of industry perspectives that preceded the present era, and then what's happened in the last 10 years. And so I'll talk about that. And so I guess what I would say is, like, depending on your personal interests, like the way that you personally are interested in engaging with this topic, keep that concept kind of in the back of your mind as I explain kind of the underpinnings and the historical background of this stuff. And then, at the end, if you want to sort of, raise a question and say, what are the implications for this particular situation, about, say, like self-driving cars or something like that, you can just sort of ask, and I'll try to sort of, draw those connections if they aren't apparent to you as the talk goes on. So to start with, I'm just going to sort of, point to a sort of an existing critical literature about AI that happened in the sort of first era, the good old-fashioned AI as it's sort of known, of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And these were authors like Hubert Dreyfus and Lucy Suchman and Phil Egera and Diana Forsyth. And they all took a very sort of, both sort of empirical and also philosophical sort of approach to understanding what artificial intelligence is and how it can be, sort of critiqued, and how it can maybe, made better or, improved in some way. And so I like this quote from Phil Egera, who says that, what is needed is a critical technical practice, a technical practice for which critical reflection upon the practice is part of the practice itself. And so, he really sort of, he was coming from a PhD program in artificial intelligence at MIT, but he started reading, Hubert Dreyfus's material and others, and sort of became inspired to be a sort of hands-on but simultaneously critical sort of agent in this discipline. So, many of you will be aware that there's this sort of, AI revolution that's been going on, sort of, scientific revolution for, in the Kuhnian sense, although there are ways to critique that. And this is sort of the way that people inside the industry talk about it. They talk about it as, nothing short of a revolution, just as electricity transformed industry after industry. For people in the field of natural language processing, there's just been this huge, sort of, tumult as these new sort of models and approaches kind of take over their entire sort of subfields. So, the transformation is real, and it's empirically sort of tangible. You can see it in the publications of papers to sort of archive the main repository for sort of preprints of AI papers. And this is just up to 2017. So it's gone, this is the orange line here being papers involving deep learning, which is the sort of, the technology underpinning contemporary AI. And, it was going up to the point that, there was a decline in non-deep learning papers on arXiv. Some more, if we add some more years to that, we can sort of see, this sort of, I don't know, I guess if you're in the COVID era, it looks like an exponential curve. I'm sure it'll slow down at some point, but currently there's just a, huge rise in this stuff, and it really is transforming certain subfields within computer science for sure. I have a sort of idiosyncratic way of looking at deep learning. It kind of looks like this. I call it an epistemic ensemble, and it's a sort of it's a system of thought that combines sort of past regimes of thinking. So ranging from behaviorism and cognitivism to connectionism, which is sort of, we know as neural networks, but also including algorithmic modeling, which we might think of as like sort of machine learning in general. It also combines aspects of structuralism, which is something I'll talk about later on when we talk about the way that these models implement sort of text and language. And then there was a missing piece that I sort of recently been working on, which is economic theory. Some of this is ideological, some of this is not directly sort of a technical sort of through line from the 1940s to the present, but there are aspects of that. So it's not insignificant, and I think that it's sort of an underrated aspect of how we should think about contemporary AI. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And so, some of you who are familiar with these ways of thinking will sort of, see you'll know that sort of some of these regimes of thought or of knowledge are in opposition to each other. So, behaviorism was a reaction against introspectionism, and cognitivism was a reaction against behaviorism. You might think of connectionism as a reaction against the good old-fashioned sort of symbolic oriented AI. And you might think of machine learning as also the sun transition. But, the interesting thing about deep learning is that it is taking these sort of oppositional ways of thought and just sort of like mashing them together into one sort of like, pretty hegemonic methodology. And so, if you're familiar with behaviorism from sort of, animal psychology, became, especially in the United States, became kind of a dominant paradigm with this emphasis on this sort of stimulus response, these sort of experimental approaches of conditioning and reinforcement. And, they basically wanted to, pretend like we don't have any way of talking about the mind. We're not going to refer to sort of internal states because we can't observe them. We're just going to do these external experiments. Cognitivism was to some degree opposed to that, but I would say that cognitivism is more characterized sort of more broadly by its metaphors of information processing. So it takes metaphors from the computers, the mainframes of the era of the 1950s and 1960s, and it sort of just does a thought experiment. It's like, what if the mind was like this mainframe? And it's kind of just still going on this way. So if you listen to cognitive scientists talk, they will sort of use these very sort of strict like information processing kind of metaphors, and it has this sort of it's a very I wouldn't say it's consistent, but it's been there are aspects of it that are kind of recognizable from the 1960s in some ways. Connectionism was definitely sort of a controversial way of approaching the sort of implementing the mind, if you want to call it that. But it had these sort of these are just sort of illustrations of kind of the some of the hallmark papers. What's interesting about contemporary deep learning is like they're not that different from what's happened before. It's not that different from this work in the 1980s and 1990s, especially in terms of the structure of the models that are used. This black box kind of algorithmic modeling approach, Leo Breiman has written very sort of nicely on this in this paper, The Two Cultures. This is the sort of the way that the parameters of these models are discovered through this kind of high dimensional sort of exploration, and the methods of that are quite old. They date back to the to Cauchy and sort of earlier mathematics. And then I'll be talking about this economic stuff later, but essentially the thing that you should know about is this idea of a loss function, and that derives from statistical decision theory in the 1940s, which was sort of came out of this group of economists at Columbia who are working on kind of wartime mathematics and statistics. So there are these distinctive features of deep learning that I should sort of just like run through, just so you kind of know. I don't know. I mean, you'll recognize some of these if you've read about AI, but I would say these are the things that kind of make that make it distinctive in a technical way. So there's this use of the machine learning paradigm, the use of layers, this sort of the multi-layer, the deep qualities of deep learning. There's this vectorization of everything, turning everything into a vector or a matrix, a loss function, which I mentioned, this optimization process, which we just saw, this sort of the algorithmic modeling stuff, but also it's sort of it's a method that often draws on large amounts of existing human labor, and also relies on sort of this types of specialized hardware. So I'll just quickly sort of walk through those. So yeah, I think I mentioned the Leo Breiman article. This is a paper that's kind of talking about that. So it's sort of comparing what you might think of as sort of academic statistical analysis to the type of work that was being done in industry in the late 1990s and early 2000s. As the kind of big data era developed, there became more of this emphasis on predictive modeling, where all you really care about is how well your model predicts some outcome of some unseen data, and that's kind of a big methodological shift that's important here. Let's see if this video works. Yes, this is a video of Jan LeCun, a sort of famous deep learning researcher at Facebook now. This is a video showing his convolutional neural network, his multi-layer convolutional neural network for recognizing digits. So this is something I'll be walking through in a sort of little coding session later on. Very briefly, I'll sort of show you what it looks like to sort of implement this kind of thing today. But yeah, this video is from, I think, the early 1990s, but based on work in the late 1980s at Bell Labs. And today these models can, something similar to that can work on much more complicated sort of images. Instead of just sort of handwritten digits, you can show and train it on images of lots of different things, and train these models to recognize dogs and clocks and cars and things like that. What's interesting, I guess, from a sort of software engineering perspective, is just like how little code it takes to sort of implement this kind of thing. So it's a very sort of generic kind of framework, this kind of modern connectionism, and if I can maybe turn on my laser pointer here, this would really be kind of black magic to the if you were in the 1990s and you were going to say oh yeah, I can detect object and images, and here's the code describing my model. Computer vision just did not look like that at the before this sort of most recent decade. There's this sort of vectorization of everything that I mentioned. Adrian McKenzie talks about this a lot in his book, Machine Learners: Archaeology of a Data Practice, which is kind of a sort of philosophical social science perspective on machine learning from a couple of years ago. And it's interesting to sort of compare this kind of vectorization of everything to sort of an earlier social science critique of a sort of a quantified world, this kind of commensuration as a social process paper, and all the work that came after that, which is all about sort of quantification. So I think of vectorization as kind of just like a high dimensional version of this, right? Instead of turning everything into a number and having your sort of everything being a grade that you're trying to improve, instead you're trying to sort of turn everything into these higher dimensional vectors and matrices, but you're still trying to optimize in some way. You're just trying to optimize at a higher and a larger number of dimensions than just one. However, you are still trying to optimize, and the language of sort of statistical optimization, as I sort of mentioned, derives from this 1940s milieu, and this is when Abraham Wald developed this notion of sort of a loss function, which is essentially arbitrary, right? The statistician can decide what the loss function is. So the statistician can decide, I want to have a certain number of parameters, but I don't want any of the parameters to get above a certain level, or I don't want them to get below a certain level, or something like that. So you can arbitrarily decide what your sort of criteria of optimization is, and then sort of your model will sort of act or will sort of be trained accordingly. So he calls this the loss. The loss is really the loss to the statistician if you take a certain action, but the true state is a or the action you're supposed to take was something else. And so it's a useful, it's a very important sort of key concept in deep learning, this loss function. And yeah, I sort of mentioned this optimization process. Typically, this is known as stochastic gradient descent, or SGD. So you'll see references to that. And like I said, it comes from the sort of mid 19th century, sort of algorithmically. So, we had this whole period, I guess like, in previous years about sort of algorithms in the social sciences, or everyone was sort of talking about the impact of algorithms and these different complex algorithms. And one thing that's interesting about deep learning is, like, from a computer science perspective, it really this one simple algorithm that's very old is kind of at the core of it, and instead it's less about algorithms than it is about architectures, or sort of maybe the techno-social structure around these things. Just to sort of draw a distinction there. Like I said, the labor comes from people. So the original sort of ImageNet data set that was used to sort of have this big success in computer vision that I'll be talking about a little bit later, derived from a huge number of Mechanical Turk workers in various countries. So 50,000 workers from 167 countries. They put together this very large labeled data set of images, so of different objects. So, it's a bicycle, a car, and whatever the labels were for all of these were all sort of manually applied by people in Mechanical Turk. And this is a sort of constant theme in contemporary AI, the sort of the need for these models to train on large amounts of data. And in the case of what's called supervised learning, the need to have sort of humans manually sort of label or tag up the data set. If you want to take sort of critical kind of Marxist perspective, you can easily sort of make analogies here to the sort of exploitation of labor at kind of like the lowest levels of this pipeline of from data to model. And then finally, sort of maybe from a like hardware and also like maybe ecological approach, there's a lot of specialized hardware that gets used and a lot of energy that's consumed to train these models. It's hard to be sort of specific about it because I think some of the it's hard to be specific, especially about the energy use, because it's something that's changing all the time and something that obviously companies like Google have a sort of incentive to improve. But for a while, in I guess around 2018, there were some pretty interesting papers that tried to quantify really like how much energy is being consumed by the training of these large models, and it is significant. I mean, it's a lot of these models that are sort of talked about today. You wouldn't be able to do them on your home computer. You need quite a sort of decent data infrastructure to train one of these models from scratch. But the result of putting all this together is what I call this sort of conquest of iconicity in terms of computer vision, especially this idea that sort of, you can automate the sort of recognition of things, that you can automate the sort of, recognizing that one thing is like another thing. This image here is from 2012. This is the sort of the first deep learning model to sort of really enter the sort of not popular imagination, but the academic, the scientific researchers' imagination. They started to realize that, these neural networks that we've been disparaging for decades are actually quite good at certain tasks, and this has only sort of developed into some of these technologies, like this kind of real-time surveillance scenario that is illustrated below. Okay, so let's like sort of zoom down to, I guess, or maybe zoom back in time to the problem that Jan LeCun was looking at in the late 1980s in Bell Labs. And so he was using this data set called MNIST, which is sort of, by now this kind of canonical deep learning data set. And the goal, again, is to take a digitized image or a digitized sort of handwritten letter and recognize that it is actually representing the number 8, this sort of like this abstract symbol 8, as opposed to this sort of array of values, which is representing a sort of a handwritten digit. And I guess, when you see something like this, I guess the way that I want to approach it is semiotically, because I think semiotics is the field that is kind of missing from computer science in some respects, and some of the basic sort of distinctions in semiotics can clear up, I think, some of the even some of the canonical debates in computer science in various ways about programming languages and things like that. It's not that computer scientists it's not that they're semiotically naive. In some ways, they do understand a lot of this stuff, but they don't really have a language to speak about it. And so I just like to, when I do get the chance to talk about just Peirce's trichotomy of signs, this distinction between an icon, an index, and a symbol. And like I said, I think this is something that engineers often have never heard of or are not aware of these distinctions in his sort of theory. And so the basic idea is that an icon is something that signifies through likeness. So when you look at this and recognize it as being sort of cat-like, that sort of cat-like awareness is something that happens through an iconic sign, this iconic sign here. Whereas if you were to see paw prints in the snow and infer from that that there may have been a cat or maybe a wild cat in this case who had been walking through the snow, that type of sort of interpretation is an indexical interpretation. So you're drawing a conclusion based on something that is sort of physically connected in some way. Or at least in your interpretation, they're physically connected. So that's an indexical interpretation. And by far the sort of, the dominant kinds of interpretation, especially in sort of theories of linguistics of the late 20th century, and also in good old fashioned AI, is this sort of symbolic type of signification where you have a sort of, a sequence of letters that are essentially arbitrary depending on what language is, they're written in. And somehow, basically through social convention of people who quote unquote know the language, they know that this sequence of letters refers to some sort of abstract concept of cats. So something like a photograph, I think you would say it's iconic indexical. It combines aspects of iconicity and indexicality. The reason it's sort of indexical is because the photograph is produced via an indexical process. So photons, bounce off reflect into a lens and absorbed into silver halide crystals, say if it's like an analog photograph, and then put in this chemical bath. And there's sort of a physical process from sort of light to image. But also we might recognize, we might interpret photographs indexically. We might say, oh, I know that stoop, or that's my cat, or something like that. So there are iconic aspects of photographs as well. But the world of computer science has always been sort of like, strictly, and not strictly, but very, very intensely in the symbolic world. So the ones and zeros that underlie information theory are about as symbolic as you can get from a Peircean perspective. Okay, so given that little detour into semiotics, we can talk about a little bit about this sort of world of vectorization, because it also involves just basically sequences of numbers that are essentially arbitrary, but at some point in the sort of social process of using artificial intelligence, they come to have meaning for us as humans. And so some of the sort of terms that are useful here, just like this, scalar is a single value, a vector would be like a sort of a sequence, or like a row or a column of values, and a matrix would be a two-dimensional version of that. And you can go sort of higher dimensions. So you can talk about vectors, and then a 2D tensor would be a matrix. A 3D tensor would be a 3D version of that. And you can kind of just keep going in multiple dimensions. And depending on the sort of complexity of your sort of AI task, you may be working at kind of a low level of just vectors and matrices, as is the case with say, like what we'll call a multi-layer perceptron for recognizing simple images. But if you're recognizing video, or you're combining aspects of, if you have like a multimodal model, then you might have these kind of higher order tensors that become part of your model. So what do these models do with the vectors and matrices and tensors? Well, they basically do what's called matrix multiplication. So if you take a vector xy, so pretend this is like a coordinate in space. So maybe I can draw with like a little pen here. If we have, if you remember sort of, your high school math, you might have a point here, and it's, at 2 on the x-axis and 1 on the y-axis. So you'd say this is, coordinate 2, 1. And if you took that point, that vector, and you multiplied it by this matrix, you'd get some new vector. And that new vector would actually be the sort of, this s of x value times x, and the s of y value times y. So essentially, this is a scaling matrix. Whatever the values are in here, we'll just multiply x and y by those values there, and it will basically stretch out the vector in space. You can also have two-dimensional matrices that affect rotation. So if you put if you put an angle in here, so if you put like pi over 4 or something, or to represent a 45-degree angle, you could sort of compute these values: cosine, sine, negative sine, cosine. And if you did this matrix multiplication, you would get a new vector that was essentially a rotated version of your original vector. So if your vector started here and you affected this matrix multiplication, you would get a new set of new values that are that represent this vector here. And I won't go too into sort of the sort of details of matrix multiplication, but rest assured it's quite a simple operation to compute by hand or by a computer. And the effect is that they can affect any of what's called the linear transformations. So if you look on the left, this sort of this kind of scaling and shearing and rotating, all of those are linear transformations, and all of those can be represented by matrix multiplications. What matrix multiplications cannot do is what you're seeing on the right, these kind of like curvy, distorted kind of things where certain things don't stay in the same place. So whether the origin doesn't stay straight, or the lines don't stay in the same position, or the lines don't stay straight, they're all different types of nonlinear transformations that are happening. And so the reason to just walk you through this math is to sort of, as we're going to see, all of AI is built on these sequences of linear and nonlinear transformations. So they're primarily linear transformations with just a little sort of splash or a little spice of nonlinearity to make it sort of possible to do sort of some of these more complex transformations that are necessary in the different AI tasks. But largely, it's these models I think are you can more or less generalize and say all that's going on is you're taking these some vectorized data, you're multiplying it by some matrices, you're adding some more vectors, you're multiplying it by some matrices, you're adding some more vectors, you're multiplying it by some matrices, and that's really all that's going on sort of under the hood. And I think that the more you understand this, the more you can be, I think, like skeptical or critical about some of the claims about what AI is going to be able to do, or whether or not we're going to achieve some sort of artificial general intelligence, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and all of these kind of these ideologies, become somewhat, depending on who you're talking to, they can start to fall apart a little bit when you sort of when you know more about what's sort of happening under the hood. So what are these matrix multiplications trying to sort of emulate? Well, they're called neural networks, and the reason they're called neural networks is because they, sort of developed in analogy to human neural networks. And so when I say neural networks in the computer science sense, they used to be called artificial neural networks, or ANNs, and that artificial has kind of disappeared. So we have this problem where, if you're talking to someone and they say neural networks, they might be a computer scientist and they mean this sort of matrix multiplication land that I was just talking about, or they could be a neuroscientist and they really mean the neural networks inside a human brain. So you have to be sort of careful with this. But the human neural networks has a sort of long history in the 20th century, starting with people like C.S. Sherrington. And so he didn't sort of do direct observation of the brain, but he developed concepts that are still important, like the synapse is something that he developed based on kind of studies of reflexes in dogs. Like, so he's part of, he's working in this kind of, behavioralist paradigm, but developing theories that become, influential for by sort of harder neuroscience later. Another one who computer scientists are sort of vaguely aware of is Donald Hebb. He's often quoted as saying that neurons that fire together wire together, which is kind of a justification for the type of training that goes on, say, in supervised learning. But he never actually says that quote directly. You kind of have to go through his writings to find out where this phrase is coming from. But it comes from these passages here where he's using this analogy of like a telephone switchboard, this kind of connectionism that is based on essentially the metaphors of the day. So the technological metaphors of the early 20th century were telegraphs and telephones, and so that's how he was thinking about it. But ultimately we get to this kind of neuroscientific model that we see today from like just a sort of textbook illustration of these neurons that have lots of sort of connections to other neurons, and they're these kind of essentially biological implementations of what in computer science you might call like a weight, so like a threshold beyond which a signal is sent or below which a signal is not sent, and that sort of thing. But these sort of the reason to bring this up, even though I think there are many ways to say that modern neural networks are not really, that closely related to biological neural networks is just because these metaphors become really sort of immediately powerful in the sort of history of computing and the history of connectionism. So this is a New York Times article from 1958, and it's already talking about this brain that is going to be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. So this just looking at this article, you can kind of see the importance of like mythology, I guess I would say, in AI, just like how strong these I don't know, these sort of science fictional influences can kind of inform people's everyday interpretations of what's going on. Because the machine that this was being written about, this is the machine called the Perceptron, by Rosenblatt. And it's really just a, if you recall my sort of matrix multiplication examples, it's just one matrix. It's one matrix multiplication essentially, and that's sort of illustrated, I guess, here. So when you see these lines, when you see a lot of these like sort of neural network diagrams that have lots of lines, you can sort of basically assume that any block of these lines can be converted into a matrix, so that each of these, and this, well, in this case, this would be a single column, a single column matrix, and this would be another one. But effectively, these diagrams can be reduced to something that looks more like this. So if this is your input, right, and the perceptron again was, it was being used for something similar to these tasks that were important later on, sort of digit recognition and just what we would call pattern recognition in general. You could take your inputs and just turn it into a single vector, and then you can multiply them by these 7,000 values. And as you can see here, this is sort of implemented in sort of, a kind of old school hardware, but today it's much simpler and you can do it in software. Take an input vector, you multiply by matrix, you add another short vector, and you get some output. And this output vector in this case has 10 elements in it, and it would reflect, for example, whether or not this machine or this model thinks that the input, if the input image is a 0 or a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5 or a 6 or a 7 or an 8 or a 9, that sort of thing. That's kind of the output of these models. And so today we would call a single layer perceptron basically like with reference to Rosenblatt's perceptron. So this is an early example of kind of a functioning sort of a one layer neural network. And you might think, well, that was in the late 50s. Surely it wouldn't have taken so long to get to multi-layer networks after that. But there was a book by Minsky and Seymour Papert, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert, called Perceptrons, where they essentially tried to like destroy the idea that neural networks would be useful. And so the illustration here, this diagram here is intended to sort of, illustrate kind of a task that they don't think that neural networks would ever be able to solve. With their simple randomly generated connections, they will probably never achieve recognition of such patterns as the class of figures having two separated parts, et cetera. And so they sort of argue that like it's not going to happen, but they do it with a very sort of crude mathematical kind of proof against the single layer network that proves to be sort of erroneous if you include the possibility of having multiple layers of both linear and nonlinear transformations. And so, yeah, this is just a sort of, I guess, if you think about in their Minsky and Papert's kind of perspective on how one should really do kind of computer vision, right? From their perspective, it's much more of this kind of like symbolic and like a rational kind of, sequence of thoughts that are yeah, just kind of, way more explicit than the kind of things that contemporary AI does. So the idea of sort of dividing a cube up into these lines and dividing the lines up into surfaces, these are things that something similar to those might be happening within these complex neural networks, but it's probably not exactly like that. And so they just sort of overrate this kind of really sort of symbolically oriented way of thinking. And so their example is this sort of XOR task. So XOR is just a logical operator where if you give it 0 and 0, in this case you get an X. If you give it 0 and 1, you get an O. If you give it 1 and 0, you get a 0, you get an O. And if you give it 1 and 1, you get an X. And they're essentially saying with a single layer perceptron, you can't implement this function. So it's the shorthand way of thinking about it is there's no line I could draw no line I can draw in this diagram that will sort of divide the x's from the o's. You can sort of, if you're familiar with linear models, and you can kind of imagine like, yeah, this would be hard to do with a linear model. However, if you just have sort of two small layers in a neural network, you could implement the XOR function. So this is a multi-layer perceptron that computes the XOR function. And in sort of matrix math, it would look something like this. So I think this works out where like if it's 0, 0 or 1, 1, then it equals 0.5. And if it's 1, 0 or 0, 1, it equals 1.5 or whatever. But it's really just breaks down into this equation. And so, there exists parameters such that you can compute this XOR function with a multi-layer perceptron, which, if you're sort of mathematically oriented, you can just sort of think of it as defining like this. You kind of have a single layer perceptron inside another layer, a larger, a sort of outside perceptron. And this G function is the nonlinearity. So you take your linear transformation, you apply a small nonlinearity, which we'll talk about in a second, and then kind of repeat the process. And so you have, a weight matrix 1, weight matrix 2, and you could do kind of a lot of stuff with just a couple layers. And in the case of like Jan LeCun's digit recognition, he had sort of like 3 or 4 or 5 of these layers. But if you have enough layers, essentially of linear multiplications and nonlinear transformations, you can do kind of a lot. And that's kind of, I think, the message of contemporary connectionism is, if you combine these particular types of architectures of matrix multiplications with large amounts of data and lots of parameters in your matrices, you can get really far. So what is the nonlinear activation function? I won't spend too much time on this. So what are these nonlinear activation functions? This is a illustration from a set of books in the mid-1980s called these Parallel Distributed Processing Volumes by Rumelhart, Jeff Hinton, and McClellan's. And this represents a kind of this early, I guess I'd say mid-80s kind of rise, or mid to late 80s rise of connectionism that doesn't really take over AI, but it becomes a kind of like tangible subfield in its own right around this time. And the types of activation functions they use are these simple, what they call this threshold output function or the sigmoid activation function. And it basically just means, take the outputs of your matrix multiplications, these new vectors that you have, and just sort of like clip them or kind of like distort them a little bit, just to tweak them slightly. And so in this case, this activation function would, any value that's below a certain level, it would just set to 0, just null it out. So any negative values would just be set to 0. And this is something almost identical to what we use today. So this is like the mathematical definition of a sigmoid function, but you could also have something like this, like tanh. And in the history of connectionism, you see people experimenting with these different sort of simple nonlinear functions. The reason they have to look a certain way is because they have to be differentiable. They have to be differentiable in order for the training process to work. What's called backpropagation. The one that gets settled on in the early 2010s is what's called ReLU, and it really is basically as simple as I said. So you take your sort of output vector after you multiply it by these matrices, and you just say, are any of these values in this vector negative? If so, make them 0. And that's basically seems to be enough of a nonlinearity that you can then, sort of train models that can do very complicated things like, say, recognize whether there's a tiger in a picture and that sort of thing. But it really all comes down to these matrix multiplications where, the matrices that you're multiplying by sort of represent the weights that you've learned about through the training process, and then these sort of simple nonlinearities. And so, in the early 2010s, you start to see these papers that, they really just introduce very, very simple concepts, and they're just sort of like, hey, this seems to work really well, so let's do it. There's a strong sort of experimental culture that develops, like as more and more people sort of realize that neural networks are capable of a lot more than they've been taught in school. There's a strong sort of like, tools of the trade kind of culture where it's just sort of like, you might find out about a neat trick from someone in your lab, but maybe there was never a sort of an official paper published on it, because there's still not a lot of, not a lot of conferences that are discussing this stuff. Although there are one or two that have sort of persisted even through these kind of fallow years of connectionism where, basically everyone in computer science was incredibly dismissive of neural network approaches. And, I mean, I studied computer science in the late 1990s, and that's what I remember too, is just sort of learning about neural networks and having people be like, oh yeah, they don't work. Gotta go do something else. And so, it's a little bit interesting and fascinating to kind of to think about kind of all of these technologies that have become so influential that everyone was just really dismissive of. So this is sort of an illustration of kind of what the role of the loss function is in training these weights. So again, think of these matrices that I've been talking about as corresponding to the weights, or the sort of parameters of your model. And the way that they're learned is through these kind of just basically showing the model a lot of data. So here's the input, here's what the output should be, see what you can figure out. And then when it gets it wrong, you basically want to give the model a signal and say, okay, you got it so wrong that you're going to need to update your parameters, the values in these matrices. You're going to have to update them by a certain amount. And that's something that this backpropagation process, or sort of algorithm makes possible. And so the goal, like I said, find the right values for these weights, given your inputs and given what the sort of predictions are supposed to be, and given the sort of architecture of your model, these different layers. And so that these are the predictions that your model might sort of spit out. The true targets are something else, and your loss function basically compares the true values. These are sort of maybe the labels that your Mechanical Turk workers put on the image, and here's your prediction. So say the input is a picture of an elephant, and you say it's a tiger, and the Mechanical Turk person said it's an elephant, and now the loss function needs to sort of compute a value that says how wrong you are that you guessed a tiger when it was actually an elephant, and produce some kind of score. Based on that score, then we're going to send that to some sort of optimization process. And this is the stochastic gradient descent, this sort of exploration of this high dimensional space. And the high dimensions represent basically all of the parameters in your model. So if your model, in the case of the Perceptron, say the Perceptron had 7,000 or so parameters, then that's your 7,000 dimensional space that you're trying to sort of explore by sort of climbing, or sort of maybe descending these high dimensional hills to find a location for which next time you guess, like if you were shown that image again, you would guess something a little bit closer to the correct elephant, as opposed to guessing that it was a tiger. So hopefully that makes sense. If you want to know sort of what the loss function actually looks like for some of these classification tasks, you can just sort of think of these, you can think of a vector that represents the true distribution over labels, and you could, and then you have another vector that represents the output. So, if you're trying to guess between, say, like 1,000 different possible objects, so it's like elephant, tiger, car, airplane, etc. That's what the ImageNet task sort of does. Then you can imagine that your sort of the output of your model is going to be some 1,000 element vector, where ideally, if you were right, you would put a 1 in the elephant column and a 0 for everywhere else. But because your model, when you start out, is just going to be randomly initialized and produce nonsense, then you're going to have produce 1,000 element vector with lots of random values, and you need to develop a sort of simple score to determine, sort of how wrong you are. And you can sort of just compute that, or give it a sort of value where it's negative log. So when you get it right, the loss is 0. When we get it wrong, the loss is some very large value. So you don't want your loss to be high. You want your loss to be low. You want to be driving your loss down by manipulating all of the parameters in your model. So these nice illustrations. There's like a sort of a set of YouTube series that does some really nice visualizations of kind of what how to think of some of these multi-layer models. So again, if we think of the input, again, it's this 28 by 28 pixel image, and that's where the 784 number is coming from. So we basically just take the image and pretend that we don't really know anything about its two-dimensional qualities. We're just gonna put this row next to this row, next to this row, next to this row, next to this row, next to this row. We're just gonna stretch it out into one long vector, forget that there's any sort of two-dimensional coherence to it, and we're just gonna send it into a multi-layer model. So we just take that sort of, every row in the image just sort of stretched out, and send it into a multi-layer perceptron, and you'll sort of get something that looks like this if the model is well trained. So in this case, it guesses correctly that the image is a 7. If you give it a 2, then hopefully all these transformations will happen, and it'll guess correctly that it's a 2. Now, recall what I said again, like whenever you see these like hairy mess of lines, this is just a matrix. There's a matrix here. You multiply the vector by a matrix and you get a new vector, and you apply a nonlinearity. You multiply that vector by another matrix and you get a new vector and you apply a nonlinearity. And then you multiply that vector by another matrix and you get some output, and that's your answer. And that's all that's happening here in this type of model. But how is it trained, right? And so this is a nice illustration of kind of, a situation, or sorry, like a moment in time when the model doesn't really know anything yet. So in this case, it's seeing a 1 and is guessing that maybe it's a 0 and maybe it's a 4. So you can kind of see this, like, the output vector isn't just guessing one value, it's guessing a sort of distribution of values. And it's wrong for most of those guesses. However, when it is wrong, you can then use this backpropagation algorithm and this optimization algorithm to modify the parameters to sort of take that signal, this like, oh, you got the guess wrong, your loss output is very high. Based on the fact that you got this so wrong, you need to go back and sort of tweak these parameters. And this is sort of a mathematically sort of deterministic process given a particular output. The GPU hardware that's used to train these models is very good at doing this kind of thing in parallel. And so it makes training these models much faster in a way that really wasn't possible, say in the 90s, if you were using like a computer with a single CPU. So having the specialized hardware really helps for the training process, and is sort of just as fundamental to deep learning as anything else. Okay, so given this description of what's really going on in a multi-layer perceptron for digit recognition, there are some interesting consequences to this. So one of the consequences is that what happens if you show it random noise, okay? And essentially, this model has never seen random noise before. It's only seen digits, or it's seen good digits and bad digits, and it's tried to learn which ones are 5s and which ones are 4s and which ones are 2s, but it's never been given noise and told this is noise. Okay, and that's really significant, but because it basically means that these models can't say, I don't know. Okay, there's just no concept of I don't know in this model. Okay, and once you realize that sort of all of the kind of classification models that got people so excited about, artificial general intelligence is just on the horizon, and self-driving cars and this or that, like all of these kind of things, they start to become, just sort of a bit of exaggeration when you realize that the model has no way to indicate that it's uncertain. Okay, I mean, you can get a hint that it's uncertain if it gives you some bad values, but it may be very confident that this image of noise is a 5. And there are other dangers too. So there's also dangers that if we give it a type of image that we haven't seen before, so say that we add some values here and here and here. Who knows what the consequences of just manipulating some of these pixels are, especially if something like that has never been seen in the training set. So there's a whole sort of school of research about what are called adversarial inputs to deep learning models, where people sort of do experiments with this kind of thing. Like what happens, can you learn how to tweak an image just in such a way to sort of produce a kind of misrecognition? And this is something that people have found is actually pretty easy to implement. So, so this is I guess like an early insight into some of the dangers of these models, right? Even though they seem like, oh, they're sort of human level performance, there are certain things that the way that they work that are really not the way like humans work at all, and potentially sort of dangerous if you implement these systems in public and put them in some downstream system that humans are accessing. There are some pretty serious dangers to that. Okay, I'm just going to sort of switch to some code here. So, but essentially, this is from a tutorial that I developed last year for some historians at Cambridge. So this is kind of battle tested on people from the humanities. I basically had them kind of download this stuff and actually tried to have them try to follow it along, but it was a longer session, so I won't be doing that here. But I think you should be able to see kind of just like how little code some of this is, and you can kind of sort of see what it looks like to train one of these models. So if you're familiar with programming at all, these are just a bunch of headers. We don't really have to worry about that. We're just importing the libraries that we need. Oh, and if you're interested sort of specifically, the low level deep learning library that is used by most people is TensorFlow from Google, and then Keras, which is another sort of higher level library that I'm using just to make some of the code simpler, is also developed by this guy, Francois Chollet at Google. He's a great book called Deep Learning in Python, and also a companion book, Deep Learning in R, depending on if you want to use Python or the R programming language. And it's probably, I would say it's probably the best kind of tutorial book for someone who has maybe not a lot of sort of computer science background. So it doesn't really assume that yes, a lot of the sort of algorithmic theory and data structures and that sort of thing. And it really just sort of shows you the code, explains how it works, kind of at a similar level to what I'm doing right now. So we're just going to load the data set. And then the data set here is MNIST. So these are the digits that I have been talking about. These bitmap images of handwritten digits. And so you can see we have 60,000 training images, and they're 28 by 28 in size. And then we have labels for all of them. So these labels, we can print them in. Oops, sorry, so it's typo. So the training labels look like this. So this is just the first 10. So the first image presumably is a 5 or is a handwritten 5. The second training image is a handwritten 0. The third training image is a handwritten 4, etc. So we have 10,000 of those labels as well. So those are something that sometime long ago in the 80s, some people did by hand. We can also just take a look at them. So this is the 4. I think this would be the third image in the list. See what the 5 looks like, right? So that's a 5, or at least it's something that should be a 5, etc. So this is what MNIST, the data set, looks like. And we can maybe look at a whole batch of them. So sort of what we're dealing with here. And like I said, you should just think of these as 28 pixels by 28 pixels, and they have some value between 0 and 255. So they're 8-bit black and white images. So we're going to have to transform the images in order to sort of get them in the right way that we want for the model. So before, I think I talked about turning that 28 by 28 image into a long 784 element vector, and so that's all that this code does here. So I think, and we also transformed the label. So in this case, the first label, I think, was a 5, right? Yes, a 5, and we turned it into what's called a one-hot vector. So this is a 10 element vector where it's 0 for everything except for the 5th element. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That represents that the number is 5. And the reason we create these new labels, these called one-hot labels, it's a term from electrical engineering. The reason we do this is because this is close to what the model is going to output. So the model is going to output a 10 element vector, which is essentially how much it thinks it's a 0, how much it thinks it's a 1, how much it thinks it's a 2, how much it thinks it's a 3, how much it thinks it's a 4, and how much it thinks it's a 5, etc. And so we want the labels to kind of match what the model is going to be spitting out. And this is all the code we need for our model, this single layer perceptron. So we're going to implement something like Rosenblatt did in the late 1950s. It takes an input shape that's 28 by 28, so that equals 784. And we can see that this is, this model as we implemented is just some sort of, Python object in TensorFlow. And then we're going to say, okay, given this model, that basically, it's going to output a 10 element vector, and it takes a 784 element vector as input. We want to say we're going to use categorical cross entropy as our loss function. This is sort of what I had a slide for before. So this is basically a loss function that says, you're right when you guess that it's a 5 and it's not a 1, not a 2, not a 3, not a 4, etc. And you're wrong if you guess anything else, and you're going to get penalized for how wrong you are. That's categorical cross entropy. And we're going to be using the sort of standard sort of optimizer. This is implementing the kind of SGD like algorithm. And that's pretty much it. And we can just sort of see the output of this. We can sort of see, okay, what did we define? We defined a model that has 7,850 parameters. And we're going to learn values for those parameters such that it's as good as it can get at guessing what the digits are. And so, this is an easy way to sort of really feel like you understand one of these models. I mean, obviously the models today are, increasingly, large and complicated, but ultimately you should be able to account for all the parameters in the model if you understand the model successfully. And so in this case, we have this 784 by 10 matrix, and then we have what's called a bias vector, this 10 element vector that we add on at the end. So it's just sort of a standard part of linear transformation. So we're learning those bias values as well. You can sort of think of them as just part of the the one linear transformation. And that adds up to 7,850. And that's indeed what we see here when we asked Harris for a summary of the model. So this is just one thing I really like to do if I want to try to understand an architecture, is just sort of spit out the number of parameters after loading it or after defining it, and then see if I can account for all those parameters. And if you can, then you probably have a decent idea of how the model works. So yeah, now let's train it. So it's a big warning, you can ignore that. And so it happened really quickly because I happened to be on a Mac Mini, which has a new sort of M1 chip that does deep learning quickly. If you did it on a slower CPU, it would be a little bit slower, but even if I run this again, it's gonna be really fast. And so right away, basically with just a single layer perceptron, so a Rosenblatt style perceptron, I'm getting accuracy of 90% on the training data. But that's just the training data. So it's already seen all of that stuff. So maybe it's not surprising that it gets 90% on stuff that it's already seen. We can also use the test data. So earlier I defined test images so that these come out of MNIST as well. The set of test images, there are 10,000 of those. And the model has never seen any of these test images before. So we're going to take this trained model and we're going to say, okay, how well can you do on the test images? So it runs over them and it gets about 91% on it. So that's the sort of final accuracy on the test set for the single layer perceptron, just this single big matrix and a bias vector. That's all we're learning here. We're not doing any complicated sequence of nonlinearities and linearities. So we can also look at what the model sort of looked like as we trained it. So this is an illustration of the loss over time. So we did what are called 5 epochs, so 5 passes over the entire data set. So how many images was it? 60,000. So we looked at 60,000 images 5 times, and we updated our parameters every 1,024 images. That's the batch size here. So that's basically what we were doing in the training process. So every 1,024 images, we said, okay, what's the loss value? And then based on that loss value, we got to update everything. So next time we do a better job. And that's all that happened during the training process. And essentially, as that's happening for each epoch, the output of that loss function is going down and going down as the parameters get better and better. So that as the parameters move in this 7,000 dimensional space, as they move closer to some point in 7,000 dimensional space that is good at recognizing digits, we get lower and lower kind of loss values because we're guessing better and better over time. And you can also visualize it from looking at the accuracy as it assesses the training data set, and that's going up and up and up. And based on these graphs, I assume we could probably do a little bit more training and eke out a little bit more performance from this if we wanted to. But maybe a better thing to do would be to add another layer or add multiple layers, because that's really where the sort of the deep learning magic happens. And so here we just basically in our definition of the model, instead of adding a single layer, we add 2 layers. So we add a layer that takes that 784 element image, and you can think of sort of compressing it down to a 512 element vector, and then taking that 512 element vector, what you might call a hidden state of the model, and it's hidden because it's in the middle of the model. It's not that you can't see it, just the sort of lingo of 1980s connectionism is the hidden state. So you take that hidden state vector, and then you turn that one into a 10 element vector. So you have a second matrix multiplication that takes a 512 element vector and turns it into a 10 element vector. And that's it. So we're just adding that sort of intermediary layer. We're just going to do the same thing. We can produce the summary, and now we can see, okay, well, our previous model, our single layer model, only had 7,850 parameters. This one has quite a bit more because it's got it's got one kind of pretty big matrix multiplication and then one sort of a smaller one. Basically, if I take 784, multiply it by 512, here, I'll just do this right now. Say 784 times 412 plus 412, that's going to be the size of our first matrix. And then size of the second matrix is going to be 512 times 10 is 10. Add those together. That should be the total number of parameters in this model, and it is. Okay, so we can then train this one. And it's going to be a little bit slower because it's got more parameters to learn. And the accuracy at the end of that on the training data was 98.9%. And let's see what it does on the test data. So it's never seen, this model has never seen the test data before, and it gets 98%. We can look at the accuracy over time as it learns. So, sort of similar graphs to what we're seeing, but maybe we're seeing a kind of plateau in terms of the loss and in terms of the accuracy here. And one nice thing here is we can look at the wrong guesses. We can say, which ones were the ones that it had the hardest time dealing with. So these are all ones that it got wrong in some way. I'm not sure what the actual wrong guesses were, but one can imagine that maybe it guessed a 4 for this. Maybe it guessed a 7 for this, or maybe probably definitely guessed a 7 for this. But other ones, maybe it's not so clear why it got them wrong. It seems like maybe it should have been able to get those. And one of the reasons that it might not be happening is because we're not really taking into account any of the two-dimensional structure of these of the data. And that's where other developments such as the convolutional neural networks come in. So yeah, I mentioned convolutional neural networks. That's the sort of next step, is to really take into account some of the relational information, the fact that certain things are two-dimensionally proximate in some way. And this animation here, I think, is a really nice illustration. So this comes from a video by this guy, Attivio Good, who, if you've ever used the Google Translate on your phone, like if you have a Google Translate app that can recognize text, like say, just like any random text, you can point it at a book written in French, and I'll try to translate it into English, or any other pairs of languages, or actually probably limited in terms of what pairs it can do, but it can do a decent amount of languages. At least give it an attempt. So that sort of that app was something that was developed by him, and that company was acquired by Google. He did this nice talk where he kind of did some nice sort of animations showing you how to think about multi-layer convolutional networks. And so that's what this is drawn from. So sort of what you see here is you've got this little like sort of filter, this little what's called a convolutional kernel. But if you've ever used like Photoshop, for example, to blur an image, if you think about like what is a blur filter really? A blur filter is implemented in terms of these like small little kernels that get sort of mapped over your image in a kind of sequential way. So you take that filter and you sort of superimpose it on top of these and do some multiplications, and then superimpose it on the next set of pixels and do some multiplications, and superimpose it on the next set of pixels and do some multiplications. So all of the sort of canonical Photoshop filters like blur and sharpen, all in the history of computer graphics, were kind of represented in these kind of these little filtered kind of ways. And so what convolutional neural networks do is they take this idea of these small little filters that can kind of affect some kind of transformation or recognition, and instead of defining them a priori, you kind of learn them through the data. And so in this image, it's illustrating a little convolutional filter that has learned something in particular. In particular, what it's learned is where the left edges are of an image. So you see it's lighting up green when there's a left edge, and it's lighting up red sort of negatively when it's a right edge. And so through this illustration, we can kind of see that like the goal of these convolutional neural networks, of including convolutions as part of our sort of pipeline of deep learning, is to essentially be able to learn some of these more, like sort of geometric transformations, at least at the very first layer. Once you get to multiple layers, it's hard to have a geometric interpretation of them. But I think it makes more intuitive sense at the very beginning when you're confronted with, say, an image of a zebra, and you want to basically imagine training some of these sort of kernels, some of these sort of smaller matrices, such that they can start to learn things like there are stripes in this image, or there's like a particular pattern of dots in this image, or something like that. You can sort of imagine these models learning something like that. And so they were initially applied to these images from what's called CIFAR-10. This is a data set that preceded the large sort of ImageNet data set that I've been referring to a couple times. These images are quite small. So this picture of a car is misleading, because the images are actually, the pixels are actually quite, there's not that many pixels in these images. But this is the sort of data set which was first used, where people first started using these like many layers of convolutions to try to determine whether or not it was a car or a truck or an airplane or a ship. There was a limited set of categories in the CIFAR data set. So what does this actually look like in practice in terms of sort of like thinking about it as matrices and multiplications? Well, before we had these incoming vectors, and we multiplied them by some matrices, and then we did some nonlinearities, and then we multiplied by some matrices, and we did some nonlinearities, and that was the end of it. Here we're going to be doing something similar, except that our transformations are going to be these convolutions. So we're going to multiply lots and lots of times these 3 by 3 sort of values on top of each other to get, say, basically a slightly smaller version of that image. So we're kind of just like passing the filter over, and then because we don't have we don't have enough pixels to cover the edges, it gets reduced a little bit. And then we're going to be doing just a simple downsampling. So we do this convolution and we get some new image. And then we do downsampling. So we just shrink the image. We take a 26 by 26 image and we shrink it down to 13 by 13. And then we learn a new set of convolutions and multiply it over here. And we get a slightly smaller image, and then we shrink it down. And then we do it again, we do it again. And the reason there are a couple of reasons why it's sort of shrinking, but one is just the number of parameters involved, but also just the way these sort of these architectures kind of evolved. It turned out that this was a good way to do it, although it's not super interpretable or intuitive in terms of what's going on in these deeper layers. And I won't spend too much time on these. This is my attempt in my slides in my class to try to really break down all of the parameters in one of these convolutional networks. So this is just a simple sort of three-layer convolutional model. Here's my sort of summary. So this is what Python would output. It would sort of say, here's your first set of convolutions. So I have 32 of these little 3x3 things. And there's a sort of a bias scalar value as well. It adds up to 320. Then you shrink it. That doesn't require any parameters because we're just downsampling, where it's like taking an image and we're making it 50% the same size. And then more sets of convolutions, more sets of convolutions. What does this look like in practice? Well, it looks kind of like these these tensor convolutions in a way. You're taking this like stack of like a 3x3 by 32, and you're kind of swiping it around this 13 by 13 by 13 image and getting a resulting 11 by 11 by 64 image, and you get 64 layers because you have 64 of these kernels. Anyway, the math gets a little nasty. I won't step through it because it's a bit slow to try to get it right. But you've got these multiple stages. You basically, all I want you to see here is that from a interpretability standpoint, this is pretty obtuse. Like if this is one of these intermediary outputs, this 5 by 5 by 64 tensor, like I don't really know what's going on in there, and like no one's ever going to be able to figure out, or it seems at first that no one will ever be able to figure out what these values kind of represent. Like if at this point the model sort of knows, say for example, something about texture, or it knows that like something is an outdoor image versus an indoor image, like where that information is located is like not going to be easy to sort of pull out of that. Okay, and that's why it's important to sort of realize what these intermediary steps look like, because there's really no obvious way to sort of introspect into the model, even though we have all the information, right? In theory, if you do an analogy to like a human brain, the reason neuroscience makes very slow progress is because it's very expensive and illegal to just sort of record from every neuron in someone's brain at the same time. It's like, you can't do that many neurons at once. B, you need to have someone who's already having some sort of really, invasive surgery in order to record from one or more neurons. And then, there's just too many neurons to record from. So, from if you, I have a background in neuroscience and neurology in part, and so it's very interesting to think about how much more data you have access to. And yet, even with all this data, it's still hard to really know what's going on. Let's see. Yeah. So just this is what you get at the end. It keeps going. Okay. Finally, you get this 576 by 64 matrix that turns your output into a 1 by 64 value. And there's a final 64 by 10 matrix that turns into a 1 by 10. And this is basically a convolutional model for MNIST that is going to sort of be the sort of the last word in whether or not it's a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 5 or a 6 or a 7. Just to mention that it's just a single step to go from this into some sort of complex classification task that would have been like impossible, say a decade ago. And that would be something like, taking images of cats and dogs and just writing a short program that can, tell you with higher than 90% accuracy whether or not there's a cat in the image or a dog in the image. The way that this can be done with even a small amount of data, and I say small, like in the order of like, tens of thousands of images, is through certain techniques, like some techniques like data augmentation. You can basically sort of take a single image and get more data points out of it by stretching it or rotating it or shearing it or doing these other types of transformations. Is a trick that you can use to try to eke out some better performance from some of these classification models. And then another technique is to sort of use what's called fine-tuning a pre-trained model. So you'll see this phrase pre-trained model. And sort of what it means is that some company like Google or Facebook has used its massive architectures to massive hardware sort of infrastructure to train a model. And you can basically take it, you get all the parameters essentially, but you don't get the data that they trained it on. And you can leverage those parameters by maybe just using most of them, if not all of them. So you're going to use some subset of those parameters. Say like, if it's 12 layers, you could say, I want to use just the first 10 layers, and then I want to retrain the last 2 layers, these last 2 matrices, on my own data. So you're basically taking the model and it's already been trained, and you're just saying, okay, let's like train the whole model, but freeze the first 10 layers and just update the last 2 layers or modify the last 2 layers. And often that can be very powerful. So you can take a model that has been trained on, say, ImageNet, so it knows how to classify 1,000 different types of objects, and you can fine tune it on just your particular task of interest. So if your particular task of interest is it a cat or is it a dog, you can very easily take a pre-trained model and just sort of like specialize it for the cats and dogs problem in the final layers. And it works really well. And you can see that, at this point, the models that we're dealing with have, millions of parameters. Okay, so this is really, if you were a statistician in the 1980s, this would be extremely offensive to you to see a model with 14 million parameters, because you'd say, oh, it's clearly, sort of overdetermined and et cetera. You'd have all these sort of theoretical justifications for why this is a bad idea. And yet it turns out to not be that bad an idea, although it does potentially lead to certain issues, as we sort of discussed. So issues of interpretability, what's really going on inside these models, issues of sort of adversarial inputs, like how do we, how can we trust that these 14 million parameters are going to act appropriately given some new input that it's never seen before? You can start to see the sort of inklings of all of these sort of AI ethics problems, like just early on in the sort of the low level sort of underpinnings of these models, which I happen, I think is a really helpful way to look at this stuff. And yeah, so yeah, in the end, if we fine tune it, we add some extra layers and train it on cats and dogs, and we add a couple million parameters, and then that's it. So that is the sort of, taking you up to 2012, the sort of deep learning, computer vision kind of stuff. I do need to mention text because it's important, especially in the last few years. Some really sort of, I guess I have no problem calling it revolutionary because I sort of was at the conference and saw the revolution in progress, where these what's called the transformer architecture kind of took over natural language processing. But it was based on NLP and neural network-based natural language processing is based on this idea of an embedding, which originally took the form of a word embedding. So the idea would be that we're going to sort of assign vectors to every word in a vocabulary of a language. So obviously, in practice, we're going to say, okay, we're going to do word embeddings for quote unquote English, and we'll just take the 10,000 most common words and try to learn vectors for those. The way these vectors are learned is through this, what's called a language modeling kind of training process, where you want to sort of take a sentence or a subset of a sentence and guess a missing word. So you take the word out and you say, can you guess what this word is? And you try to train a neural network based on that task. And if you do this, and this is something that, sort of something similar to this, not exactly because it wasn't quite couched in the kind of language modeling sort of terminology, but it was essentially something like this was used to develop these data sets of word embeddings or word vectors. When you see word vector and word embedding, it's the same idea. You're basically, taking a word like cat, and you're basically discovering through some training process, through some looking at large amounts of text and seeing which words are adjacent to each other, finding some value in high dimensional space that corresponds to cat, and then finding some value in high dimensional space that corresponds to dog, and finding some point in high dimensional space, and high dimensions here would be 100 or 200 element vectors or something like that. Finding a point in high dimensional space for king, finding a point in high dimensional space for queen. And then you might think, I've got all these vectors that refer to words. What happens if I like do math on them? Okay, what happens if I take the vector for king and I subtract the vector for man and I add the vector for woman? Does that put me in some point in this 200 dimensional space that is close to the queen vector? And it turns out that the answer is like, kind of. It's not exactly for many cases, but for some people it was close enough they got super excited. And I would argue that the way that they got excited about this is not really at an underlying level, not that different from the way that people got excited about structuralism in the 1960s. So that's a strong claim. I can try to defend that with the sort of quote from this Octavio Good talk that I mentioned before. He also does this visualization of word embeddings. And so here he has them, he's taken this 200-dimensional space and he's just projected it down to 3 dimensions, right? So you can spin it around. And now if you look up at the top, he's projected that further onto a single 2-dimensional axis of good versus bad. The fact that he chooses good versus bad is entertaining from an ethics perspective, because he's basically implicitly taking every word in the vocabulary and the vector that's been learned for it and saying, okay, where is this on a good versus bad axis? And, I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to make any serious conclusions based on that, but you can imagine someone writing software that takes advantage of these word embeddings and winds up reproducing some of the sort of learned ideology of what is good and bad that happens to be completely based on whatever the training data was. However, let's just go and look at how he talks about it. So he says the idea here is you can take a word tree and say how happy or sad that is, or how good or bad that is. That's another dimension, how big or small that is. For any word, you could do this. You can feed Wikipedia into a neural network, and it can just figure out good places to put all these words that represent all the different properties of these words. And then once you've got these words in a high dimensional space, you can do very interesting things. You can do vector math on them. So this is just the way he thinks. And I think that this way of sort of taking meaning and thinking of it as a high dimensional space that you can work with is really not that different from the way that Levi-Strauss got excited about meaning through his sort of, I would say, sort of large, almost big data oriented approach of looking at mythology, myths across many different cultures, across continents, and trying to sort of find the sort of structural similarities in the sort of narrative structures of these myths and in the sort of high dimensional kind of concept of these myths. So there's some interesting kind of connections here that I think can be appealing if you're from more of a anthropology or humanistic kind of background. And then finally, the way that machine translation it works these days is by taking these word embeddings and sort of sending them into some neural network. It outputs something that you can think of as a sentence vector. So here it's called context. I wouldn't call it context. I would call it a sentence vector. And then a decoder can kind of spit out some of the translation. This is also kind of very innovative. This kind of blew people's minds, I think, in mid 2010s that this could work well, because the way that machine translation had worked in the past was much more complicated, made much more assumptions about linguistics and that sort of thing. And so people got mad. They said, you can't cram the meaning of a whole sentence into a single freaking vector, said the professor of the good old fashioned AI school. But it turns out that you kind of can do that to some degree. I mean, if you want to critique it from a pragmatic or humanistic or communications perspective, you definitely can, but it is superior for machine translation in many ways. Obviously, evaluating this stuff is its own complicated mess. But the models these days that do this kind of thing are popularly known as BERT and GPT-2. So if you see this if you understand this picture, there's an encoder and there's some vector and there's a decoder and there's some output. Then when you see references to something called BERT, that is just a very successful encoder. And then GPT-2 and GPT-3, these models that that generate sort of convincingly looking text in English, those are the decoder sort of sections. Okay, and that's all I'm going to say about sort of the underpinnings of neural networks. I wish I could get into more detail, but it's hard to do in less than an hour. So I'm gonna talk about the sort of the ethics stuff now. I'm going to sort of say, okay, here's what we know about the underpinnings, and then here's some of the sort of issues that have developed in the last decade. But I also need to talk a little bit about some of the ethics controversies of previous previous iterations of AI. And so a very famous one was this program Eliza that was a sort of almost like a therapist kind of chatbot. You could sort of think of it, although it was described differently back then. The guy at MIT, Joseph Wiesenbaum, who developed this, really was not thinking of this as being sort of an illustration or an implementation of like a real artificial intelligence. Instead, it was sort of a way to interrogate and explore some of the limitations of the existing paradigms of artificial intelligence. And so he says, the goal was to demonstrate that this communication that was implemented between, as it was currently, as it was at the time implemented between man and machine was superficial, but it had the almost almost complete opposite reaction. So he writes about how, he was startled to see how quickly and very deeply people conversing with this doctor program became emotionally involved in it, how they anthropomorphized it, the spread of the belief that it demonstrated a general solution to the problem of computer understanding of language. And, to read this stuff in the 70s, he's already way ahead of his time of some people today, I would say. I tried to say that no general solution to that problem is possible, i.e. that language is understood only in contextual frameworks, and even these can be shared by people to only a limited extent, and that consequently even people are not embodiments of any such general solution. But these conclusions were often ignored. So he was in this community that was just like very excited about artificial intelligence, very excited about some of the sort of utopian visions of artificial intelligence that have been inspired by sort of science fiction and other writings. And so he sort of became essentially from this day and from that moment onward became more of a proponent of ethics in engineering and in artificial intelligence. So he's one figure that had that kind of conversion. Another interesting one is this guy, Ron Howard at Stanford. This is more of a lesser known story, but something that I was sort of uncovering in some recent research. So he was someone at Stanford in this engineering and economic systems department. This is Ken Arrow, so I'm just sort of showing you that there's the interesting sort of connection between economics and artificial intelligence that happens at Stanford in the 70s and 80s. And so he developed something called decision analysis. And this is much more in the good old fashioned AI tradition of sort of thinking about rational decision making and kind of computing a set of probabilities in a tree that would say allow like a doctor to try to come to some conclusion based on some complex set of evidence. And so there was this strong connection with medical informatics that was happening at Stanford at this time. But he has this kind of conversion moment in the late 70s. He was like, I hadn't thought about the whole environment in which we make decisions, because you could be a great decision analysis, but decision analysis has no moral content in it. You can think about how to assassinate somebody. It's like an adding machine, et cetera, and like, people work on this for decades without coming to this realization, which is, a little bit shocking, but certainly seems to be the case. And I would say, just from a sociological perspective, what's happening in in a lot of economic theory, and then also kind of the things that derive from economic theory, like decision analysis, they sort of conflate different forms of value. And so, like Max Weber in sociology, distinguishes between some of these types of value, between what's called instrumentally rational, or Zweck rational, and the value rational, the Wert rational. And so, the instrumental rationality is this kind of, like where, you really sort of, you care about the numbers and the numbers alone. But the value rationale might include, actions that you might take to put into practice your convictions, regardless of what the numbers say. And often, these types of value are sort of conflated in this research, and it becomes sort of, it leads to problems downstream. And I would say that if you now take what I just said and think about that loss function, right? It's like an arbitrarily defined loss, or arbitrarily defined function that gives you just some number, like how good am I doing, And most of, if not all, contemporary AI is predicated on some kind of loss function that says how well I'm doing, but it's just a number, it's just up or down, right? So in order to implement the Wert rational into this Zweck rational is still an open problem, I think, in AI. There's people who claim to be working on this, but I think that, in my opinion, they're too infected by this kind of, rational choice kind of ideology. Although maybe that's changing. We'll see next year. So, and this is just an illustration of kind of how far this economic rationality perspective got. It really infected like the main textbook for AI, the one that almost every undergraduate who studies artificial intelligence would have read, and not just in English, in many languages. It was translated to many languages. And the first edition was in 1995. And it really just has this sort of rationality, this economic rationality, as the core of what intelligence is in this textbook. Now, that doesn't mean that every teacher who used this textbook focused on that, but it's there. And I think it does, in a roundabout way, kind of have a pretty strong influence on what happens in this century. But it's not just that. I think there's certain aspects, certain other cultural aspects that are important to recognize. So one is this notion of the singularity. And this becomes kind of really, like, I guess, like, popular among different groups of people in different times. It maintains a kind of stable interest around the Bay Area, around Stanford and Berkeley, that I can sort of measure, and also in these kind of these kind of, I guess, like extropian communities. There are these kind of like people who get excited about the internet in San Francisco in the 90s and in a sort of, in this way about improving sort of, or taking humanity to some next or transcendental kind of level. There's a bunch of different places that this manifests itself. So it's a little bit more niche maybe than the kind of economic rationality inside of the artificial intelligence textbook, but it does have a strong influence on kind of how early AI develops, like in the 20th century, or early contemporary AI, this sort of 2010s kind of stuff. It still has a pretty strong influence. And so this is where these ideas about artificial general intelligence, et cetera, kind of derive from. And so there's this notion of this singularity, this moment where, we're going to have, AIs that are so smart that they're going to become like, smart in an exponential way. And so we want to be able to contemplate how smart they are, et cetera, et cetera. As you can tell, I'm not a huge proponent of this way of thinking. It doesn't, the axioms of it don't really make sense to me. So, it's almost hard for me to critique, although I do think that it does have some origins in this kind of the economic rationality and game theory kind of ways of seeing the world in order for this to make sense. But so as you can see that there were kind of these singularity summits in the Bay Area in the late 2000s. And, this ideology, was reasonably prevalent among people who studied artificial intelligence at that time, I would say. That's not true across the world, but it was noticeable to me, at least in the American context. And so you would have these meetings that happened about AI and ethics and sort of the impact of AI, but they're happening in 2009. So they're happening before the deep learning revolution, and then they're really interesting to look at. Here's Andrew Ng, so he's a major figure in deep learning, sort of present at these conferences, but by no means are these composed of connectionists. They're not, at this point, and not everyone is excited about deep learning. In fact, only a very small number of people are. But they're still discussing, like, what do we do when we have human level AI? Like these are the ethical challenges that they're concerned with. They're like, what happens if we create the mega machine brain? Like that's, they don't talk about it like that. But you can look at it, and if you don't understand the sort of the underpinnings of the singularity way of thinking, it really it just seems kind of alien in some respects. However, in 2012, we sort of have this what is retrospectively famous result of Jeff Hinton's team basically developing a convolutional multi-layer model that does really well on this large data set called ImageNet that is composed of all of these mechanical Turk labels. There's sort of a pretty good pop science book came out this past year that talks about how behind the scenes of this conference, Jeff Hinton is actually taking bids from Facebook and Google and Baidu about how much they want to purchase him and his two grad students who wrote this paper for, and it winds up being 44 million after a couple of days of auctioning. So there's a lot of money going behind this kind of apparently scientific result. And also it should be mentioned that it's still multiple years before this stuff really captures any kind of popular consciousness or even awareness kind of outside of computer science. But there's other sort of popular works that are kind of influencing the way people think about this stuff. So these two professors at MIT Business School are sort of writing about, how, machines are going to replace people's jobs. And, it's not that hard for probably most of us to recall a moment in time where AI was going to replace truckers, which is pretty amusing in the UK context, where we just had this, or we still have this huge lack of people to drive trucks. So it did not quite pan out as some of these descriptions sort of held, but this is all part of the sort of cultural milieu that's kind of defining what I would call like pre-social science AI ethics. So this is the kind of stuff that if you are concerned about the impact of AI, you're kind of concerned about A, the singularity, B, replacing low-skilled jobs, that and it's also mixed up with this the super intelligence work from Nick Bostrom. So this is also kind of singularity related kind of material from my perspective. But again, it's mixed in with these scientific results that are really powerful. So this is the model from DeepMind that was successful at the game of Go. And if you remember what I talked about in these diagrams of convolutional networks, you can start to understand kind of how the Go algorithm worked in a way. You have a network that can look at the board and basically do a bunch of matrix multiplications, and the decision being what move you should make. And you can also have another model that looks at the board and says, is this a good board or a bad board? And these are the types of sort of convolutional models that are built into the successful AlphaGo model. But again, like with all this stuff at the same time, if you ask people in industry what are the AI ethics challenges, they're working in this world of trolley problems, this kind of like this fantastical problem from philosophy about deciding whether or not if you take this action, you're responsible for killing this person, and this sort of thing that winds up being, I think, really irrelevant. But if in 2017, I think even I saw a talk by someone who's like a Google ethicist, and they were mainly concerned with trolley problem-like material. However, there was a sort of intervention, and this intervention I think happened in 2016 with the introduction of Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, which is not specific, and also this the ProPublica study on the Compass model for recidivism. These are really about machine learning and not about deep learning specifically, but they wind up sort of setting the stage for future critiques of architectures involving neural networks. So it's still useful to kind of go back and see what they're referring to, even if it's not referring to kind of like the latest and greatest models that are unfolding in the computer science research field. In the same year, there were two important papers that critiqued essentially what's going on with the word vector training. So we talked about word vectors, word embeddings. These two papers kind of came out simultaneously and basically noted like, hey, when we train these word vectors on a bunch of text, it learns things about these concepts that are these, it puts these words, it locates them in some high dimensional space in a way that is necessarily distorted by the training data. And so that might seem sort of common sense now, but 5 years ago it was not common sense. And so this is a pretty, I don't know, I think like, I don't know if it might not have been a shocking result to the people who worked in the field, because they could sort of intuitively say, well, yeah, okay, I guess that makes sense. But the entire idea of like these models being necessarily, distorted by their training data, whether they're biased or not biased or whatever, that starts to become more of a common sense notion with this research, and then it develops into, especially after the U.S. election, commentaries on sort of our recommendation systems driving people into a particular kind of niche sort of politics, or how is Google's image search or text search biased by virtue of how they trained it. These books and articles start to develop in this way. And I guess I'll finally mention the kind of the GPT-2 models and GPT-3 models, these models that can generate fairly convincing English language text. This becomes its own, sort of own location for these kind of debates, because they've trained this model on essentially all outgoing links from Reddit. So on reddit.com, if anyone links to a web page that's in English, that was scraped up, and that was what trained GPT-2, and that's what trained GPT-3. Maybe they added some more stuff for GPT-3. And this sort of uncritical just slurping up of huge amounts of data, is something that people had come to see as ethically problematic. And so there was, a paper in 2020 about the dangers of what they call stochastic parrots, these models that can just spit out text without really, from their perspective, understanding meaning of language, although I think you can debate that. This winds up turning into this whole sort of controversy where Google fired one of the main authors of this paper, and then another person had to quit, and sort of this sort of conflict between basically people in industry who are working on this on the sort of the ethics of AI, not being able to sort of be alongside the people who are actually building the models. And so there's been some interesting developments, I think, in the research field in the research conferences that have come out of this, where researchers are encouraged to basically write about the ethical impact and social impact of their work. But this is a really sort of recent development, and it's not obvious to me that it's going to have the same impact that maybe the people who wrote this up maybe would expect, especially because GPT-3, which is sort of the successor of this model here, won the best paper award for NeurIPS 2020. So if there were ethical issues, it didn't make an impact there. All right, so I'm really sorry that went a little bit over long, and I will stop here. And if there are any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, I'm happy to go for it. Right, so what's the benefit of using a deep neural network? Maybe I didn't stress this enough, but somewhat better at to working with than some of the previous what I would call algorithms that work on tabular data. So tables of symbols. Convolutional models can take into account this kind of two-dimensional data that's like in a photograph. Other types of models like RNNs and LSTMs can deal with temporal data, so data that's unfolding in time. So whether that's words in a sentence or audio signals or that sort of thing. So there's this kind of different types of signs can be dealt with using neural networks in a way that was not really available to some of these other methods. Like you couldn't use a decision tree on an image or on a sound file. There was no sort of obvious way to do that. I mean, you could try, but it didn't do anything very useful. Same thing with sort of some of these other types of classifiers. Something like nearest neighbors. There's also a whole world of unsupervised learning, and something like clustering would be like a good example of this. There are lots of machine learning models that work in an unsupervised way. I haven't really discussed that at all here. So. But depending on, if you have like a complete lack of labels, so to speak, then you're in the world of the quote unquote unsupervised. And I would say that, this period of AI that I've been discussing was much more focused on the supervised kind of landscape. So there was an emphasis there. How these social ethical considerations arose quite late in the game. Yeah, and that was really what I was trying to get across in that second talk. The reason I spent so much time on the way they were thinking before is just it was really dramatic, the extent to which I think they were not really thinking and about the right types of problems. But I would say that it has changed to some degree, but I mean, if you ask me like what the status quo kind of like mental model of an engineer in terms of whether they should be taking ethics into account on an everyday basis, I would say probably still relatively low. I think a lot of that has to do with this kind of educational, trajectory where, you get exposed to, I mean, I think, like I tried to use with the example of the undergraduate textbook, the artificial intelligence textbook by Norvig and Russell. That book is really ideologically biased in a very strong way that is not, that would not be acceptable to a lot of people in the social sciences who are writing these critiques. I think it does have an impact. I think, you can't discount kind of like what people learn early on, especially, with, their students, like high school students who are, very good at deep learning, and they go straight into college with already a kind of an understanding of some of this stuff. If they don't learn about some of these issues early on, they can go pretty far without caring in this sort of, in a university or engineering kind of context, depending on where they are. So, I'm a big proponent of kind of integrating these critiques and commentaries into the actual technical training. It's not something that's easy to do in most, it's not something that's easy to do everywhere, but I think increasingly, especially in the United States, you see some of this material get integrated into even technical kind of PhD level classes. In my case, it's possible to do because I have this students with an interdisciplinary kind of background. Yeah, unsupervised versus supervised versus self-supervised. I will say that like these terms are not, like if you approach them from a critical social science perspective, like they don't really make sense. If you think about human learning, for example, human learning is just like only in like an extreme case can you really think of it as like asocial. There are many existing theories of learning over the 21st centuries that have been developed that are not taken into account at all in the world of machine learning and deep learning. So, I mean, just to use a famous example, like, Vygotsky's theories of learning are not something that anyone, knows about or cares about with a couple exceptions in the deep learning field. However, he has like a very sort of interesting, like semiotically nuanced, like understanding of the relationship between, the teacher and the student and the environment and the interactions and all these things unfolding over time. There's a lot about human learning that like doesn't well correspond to the way that these models learn. And so specifically this idea that supervised learning is when you have labels is just kind of like offensive if you care about the teacher-student relationship. If you care about a teacher who's kind of like observing the student, observing kind of like their trajectory, trying to anticipate it, trying to take actions based on what is best for them next, all of those kind of ways of thinking are very rarely incorporated into the kind of training regimes of these models. So that's what I'll first say. So if the phrases don't make sense, there's a reason for that, is because they're not, they don't have good analogies to learning in general. And so, if you're a computer scientist, however, this is the way it works. Supervised means you have labels. Unsupervised means you don't have labels. Self-supervised is this term for example, the language models. So that like BERT, for example, model, the BERT encoder that takes large amounts of text and tries to guess a missing word. That is what's called self-supervised, because it's kind of like you have a label, right? Because you sort of mask out the word and you try to get the model to guess it, but you kind of got it for free, right? You didn't hire someone on Mechanical Turk to tell you what the missing word was. And so in a way, it's supervised learning, but it didn't involve Mechanical Turk, and that's what self-supervised seems to mean. However, that does not mean that it did not come from human labor. There were many humans that were writing out English text for some reason or another, and you've just sort of scraped that all up because you downloaded it from the web and you trained a giant model on it. That doesn't mean there was no human labor involved. But this term self-supervised kind of implies that you didn't have to, use that sort of extra human labor. But it's really from a critical perspective, they're just kind of deflecting the source of the data, right? They're pretending like it didn't come from humans. So can I say that self-supervised doesn't include feature engineering? I mean, I think a lot of the supervised models also don't involve, a lot of the supervised models don't involve feature engineering either. So that's, one way people got excited about convolutional networks, is they got excited about the fact that you no longer had to manually integrate edge detectors into your object detector, for example, whereas before you would kind of have to, sort of have a stage that would do edge detection and the stage that would do, some sort of like, texture detection or something like that, and sort of try to glue them all together. Whereas in these multi-layer convolutional networks, it works in a kind of end-to-end way. You don't have to specify specific quote unquote features. So yeah, I don't think that's specific to self-supervised. Okay, question about, is it environmentally ethical to train deep neural networks? Yes, for purposes, sorry, I didn't mean to say it was environmental ethical. I think it depends, but is it with massive data sets for a purpose which has minimal societal impact? I think it's hard to anticipate that's the extent of the social impact of something that you're working on, and a lot of people in this field have a over exaggerated imagination of how much impact their models might have, and then others have a realistically exaggerated view. So if you work on the large language models that are behind Google search that that were being critiqued by the Bender and Gebru article, that has a huge social impact. That's Google search. It's like tons of millions of searches a second. It's like not insignificant. So depending on where you are, it can have a massive social impact. And so you might think, okay, well, this is justified. On the other hand, it's more about the sort of what type of social impact is that? Is it a good social impact? Is it a potentially problematic social impact? I think it really depends on the situation. And I think that right now, it's only in recent years that researchers have been willing to sort of do something that, like a conference paper where they might think, okay, this is just like sort of, some normal science that I'm developing, and maybe it won't have an impact right now, but it'll have some downstream impact later on. They're being asked in these conferences to sort of estimate the potential societal impact, and it's not something that they're used to doing. Right. So this phrase dual use, I believe it has a military origin. I'm not 100% sure. I hadn't seen it before. So often things that I haven't seen before, and because I sort of studiously ignored the military when I was living in the United States for a long time. I believe it has this meaning of kind of like it can be used for both good things and bad things. I don't know. I guess I don't really like using that phrase because it seems too one-dimensional. It assumes that there's a good-bad axis, kind of like Ottavio's good slide before. And I really think that there, that you have to consider all possible purposes, whether or not you are sort of labeling them as being good or bad. And it does, and as you mentioned, if you want to have government regulations for this kind of thing, that makes it more complicated because it's much harder to say to what extent a particular technology is good or bad and in what way. However, I mean, I will say that if regulators understood kind of what's going on with these models better, they would have a better chance of being able to anticipate kind of what the potential downstream impacts might be. But I will say that it's the researchers themselves that really have that skill of trying to sort of doing that kind of combinatorial thinking where you're like, oh, I saw this paper with this model, I'm going to like flip it around so it does this with with images instead of sound, or with images and text at the same time, or something like that. And I'm constantly impressed with the sort of the creativity in terms of like how to get these architectures to work in other modalities. And so that's why I don't want to disparage computer scientists as being bad at semiotics. Like I think they're unconsciously really good at it, but I think that the lack of reflexivity is what becomes the problem. So yeah, it would be nice to be able to try to create a general framework for all of AI, but I don't think it's possible. I think as new architectures are developed and unfold, you kind of have to look at them on their own terms and say, okay, what is this specific sort of genre of innovation? Like, what is its potential sort of, potential impact? And I think at this time, it's often very easy to just sort of look at the training data and say, okay, where's this training data coming from? Did you get it legally? Did you get it in a kind of gray area, kind of web scraping, kind of downloading kind of way? And a lot of the most impressive models do have those kind of origins. So that's one step where you can at least intervene and say, where did this data come from? Is it yours? How do you know that what's in it? Like did you actually analyze it and try to determine, for example, the ways in which it's biased or not biased, that sort of thing, is like an easy step you can take without necessarily knowing a ton about the internal architecture. Okay. All right. Well, it's good chatting with everyone, and hopefully that was informative and or interesting.